Kelly, Aunt Daniel's scrub still smelled like disinfectant as she pulled into the gravel driveway of her childhood home in Asheville, North Carolina. The October evening air was crisp, carrying the scent of dying leaves and wood smoke from distant chimneys. She'd driven straight from her shift at Mission Hospital, exhaustion weighing heavy on her shoulders, but Rick's call had been urgent enough to warrant the hour-long drive. "Kelly, thank God you're here," Rick said, meeting her at the front door. At toothy 8, her younger brother looked older than she remembered. Hollow eyes, stubble that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. "It's getting worse." She followed him inside the modest ranch house their grandmother had left him. The familiar scent of old wood and her grandmother's lavender sachets still lingered, but something else hung in the air now, something cold and metallic that made her skin crawl. "Tell me again what's been happening," Kelly said, settling onto the worn plaid couch she'd known since childhood. Rick ran his hands through his disheveled hair. "It started 3 weeks ago, right after I cleaned out Grandma's storage room. I found this old thing wrapped in newspaper." He gestured toward the mantelpiece where a carved wooden figurine sat innocuously among family photos. About 8 inches tall, it depicted a robed figure with an indistinct face, the wood darkened with age and wear. "I thought it was just some religious statue Grandma kept. But ever since I brought it out..." Rick's voice trailed off as a door slammed somewhere in the back of the house. Kelly jumped. "Was that the bathroom door? It's been doing that all week. Watch this." Rick walked over to the figurine and picked it up. Immediately, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. A low, guttural groan echoed through the house, seeming to come from the walls themselves. Kelly's nursing training kicked in, her rational mind searching for explanations. Maybe it's the old pipes? This house has always had... Another door slam, this one from the kitchen, then another from down the hall. The sounds came in rapid succession, like someone moving through the house slamming every door they could find. Rick set the figurine back down, and the sounds stopped. "Jesus," Kelly whispered, her skepticism evaporating. In 15 years of nursing, she'd seen people at their most vulnerable, witnessed inexplicable recoveries and sudden declines that defied medical explanation. But this was different. This was something reaching across the boundary between what was known and what was feared. "It gets worse when I try to get rid of it," Rick continued. "Last week, I put it in the garage. That night, every door in the house slammed continuously for 3 hours. When I tried to throw it away, dark smoke started pouring out of the vents. Not regular smoke, something that moved like it was alive." Kelly studied the figurine more closely. Despite its crude carving, there was something unsettling about its proportions. The way the robed figure's head tilted at an unnatural angle. The wood itself seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "Rick, where exactly did Grandma get this?" "I don't know. There was no note, no explanation, just wrapped in old newspaper from 1987. He pulled out a yellowed clipping. "But look at this. It was wrapped in a story about a house fire." Kelly read the headline. "Historic Hartwell home destroyed in blaze. Family of 4 perishes." The accompanying photo showed the charred remains of a once grand Victorian house. The caption mentioned it had been known locally as the House of Hurt, and pain due to a century of tragic deaths within its walls. A chill ran down Kelly's spine that had nothing to do with the figurine's presence. "Rick, we need help with this. Professional help." "You mean like an exorcist?" "I was thinking more like someone who understands these things. Someone who might know what we're dealing with." As if in response to her words, the lights in the house flickered, and for just a moment Kelly could have sworn she saw a small figure dart across the hallway, something no taller than a child but moving with unnatural speed. The investigation was about to begin. Dr. Sarah Whitmore answered her phone on the 3rd ring, her voice carrying the slight rasp of someone who'd spent years speaking to both the living and the dead. Kelly had found her number through a referral from a colleague whose grandmother had sworn by Sarah's abilities. "You're describing an attached haunting," Sarah explained over coffee in her cluttered home office 3 days later. Crystals, old books, and electromagnetic field detectors competed for space on every surface. "The entity isn't bound to your brother's house. It's bound to the object." Rick shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "So getting rid of it won't work?" "Objects can carry trauma, especially those connected to violent death or prolonged suffering. They become anchors." Sarah's eyes, a pale green that seemed to see more than they should, fixed on the wrapped figurine Kelly had reluctantly brought. "May I?" Kelly nodded, and Sarah carefully unwrapped the carving. The moment her fingers touched the dark wood, her expression changed. Her eyes rolled back, showing only white, and her voice became different, older, more hollow. "So many voices," she whispered. "Children crying in the walls, fire and screaming, and something else, something that feeds on the fear." A crash from upstairs made them all jump. Sarah's twin daughters, Emma and Sophie, both 16, had been doing homework in their rooms. "Mom," Emma's voice carried down the stairs, high and frightened. They rushed upstairs to find the girls' bedroom in chaos. Books had been swept from shelves, and the mannequin head Emma used for practicing. Cosmetology had somehow moved from the dresser to the center of the room. As they watched, it slowly turned to face them, its blank plastic features somehow conveying malevolence. "It started moving the second you touched that thing downstairs," Sophie said, pressing herself against the far wall. "It turned its head and looked right at me." Sarah immediately wrapped the figurine back up, but the damage was done. The entity had tasted a new location, new people to torment. "This is bigger than I thought," Sarah admitted, her face pale. "I need to make some calls. There are others who've encountered similar phenomena, scattered across different states. I think your grandmother's figurine might be part of something larger." That night, Kelly stayed at Rick's house, both of them too unsettled to be alone. At 3:17 a.m., they were awakened by what sounded like a child's voice whispering Rick's name from the hallway. When Kelly crept to the bedroom door to listen, she heard tiny footsteps pacing back and forth on the hardwood floor. But when she opened the door, the hallway was empty. The next morning, Sarah called with disturbing news. "I've been in contact with paranormal researchers in Tennessee, Ohio, and Texas. They've all documented similar activity, always connected to objects. That can be traced back to a location called the Hartwell House. The house your grandmother's newspaper clipping mentioned. The one that burned down in '87? That's the thing, Kelly. It didn't burn down completely. The shell of the house is still standing, and it's become a magnet for paranormal investigation teams. Every group that's gone there has captured evidence of the same entities you're dealing with. Featureless faces on thermal cameras, shadow figures the size of children, and always that same groaning sound." Kelly felt her stomach drop. "So we're not the only ones? Far from it. There's a whole network of hauntings connected to that place, and I have a feeling that as long as that figurine exists, the activity is only going to get worse." As if to punctuate her point, every door in Rick's house slammed in. Unison, the sound echoing like gunshots through the quiet morning. The evidence arrived by email over the next few days, each piece more chilling than the last. Sarah had connected with paranormal investigators across the country, all of whom had encountered similar phenomena. From Tennessee came thermal camera footage of Liberty High School, abandoned, since a series of student suicides in the early 2000s. The images showed humanoid shapes with no discernible features moving through. Empty corridors, their heat signatures impossibly cold instead of warm. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to her laptop screen during their video call. "These same faceless figures have been captured at 3 different locations, all tied to objects that originated from the Hartwell house." The Ohio evidence was more disturbing. Security footage from a small-town antique store showed a figure no more than 3 feet tall, draped in what looked like a tiny robe, darting behind customers. It moved with jerky, unnatural movements, always just at the edge of the frame. The store owner said items would go missing and reappear in different locations, Sarah explained. Always items that had come from estate sales of houses with violent histories. He finally had to close the store after customers started reporting that their children would wake up screaming about the little dark man who visited them at night. But the most unsettling evidence came from Texas, where a young mother had submitted a home security video that made Kelly's blood run cold. The footage showed a toddler's bedroom in the early morning hours. The 2-year-old was sleeping peacefully when suddenly he sat bolt upright in his crib. For several seconds, he seemed to be listening to something only he could hear. Then, with a force impossible for a child his age, he grabbed his bedroom door and slammed it shut. "Play it again," Kelly said, leaning closer to her laptop screen. In the replay, she noticed something she'd missed before. Just before the child woke up, there was a voice, barely audible but definitely there. It was calling the toddler's name in a sing-song whisper that made her skin crawl. The mother said he'd never been able to close that door before, Sarah continued. It was too heavy and the handle was too high. But that night, he slammed it with enough force to crack the frame. "What did the family have?" Kelly asked, though she already suspected the answer. "A music box, 19th century, carved with the same robed figures as your brother's statue. It had belonged to the woman's great-aunt, who'd lived in a boarding house in Virginia that burned down in 1923. When investigators traced the history, they found that the boarding house had been built with lumber salvaged from the Hartwell house, Kelly finished. Exactly. It's like the trauma was embedded in the very wood, spreading out across the country, piece by piece as the house was dismantled and sold off over the decades. Rick's voice came through the phone, tight with exhaustion. How many of these objects are out there? Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Dozens, maybe hundreds. The Hartwell house was enormous, a lumber baron's mansion built in 1847. When it finally became too dangerous to inhabit in the 1920s, everything was sold at auction. Furniture, decorative elements, even structural timbers. They scattered across the country like seeds. That night, the activity at Rick's house escalated dramatically. Kelly had decided to stay the weekend, hoping to document whatever was happening. She set up her phone to record continuously, positioning it to capture the hallway where most of the disturbances occurred. At 2:45 a.m., the groaning started. But this time it wasn't just a sound. It was a voice, low and guttural, speaking words in a language Kelly didn't recognize. The temperature in the house plummeted so rapidly that their breath became visible. Then the shadows began to move. Kelly watched in horror as dark shapes detached themselves from the walls, flowing across the floor like liquid smoke. They seemed drawn to the figurine, circling it with increasing speed, until they formed a vortex of darkness around the mantelpiece. "Rick," she whispered, shaking her brother awake. "Rick, look at this." But when they both turned toward the living room, the shadows suddenly stopped moving. In the absolute stillness that followed, they heard something that chilled them both to the bone, the sound of a child crying somewhere deep within the walls of the house. "Kelly," Rick said, his voice barely audible, "that crying, I've heard it before, in my dreams, and I don't think it's coming from inside the house." "What do you mean?" "I think it's coming from inside the wood itself." The next morning, Sarah called with news that would change everything. "I found him," she said, her voice tight with excitement and fear. "I found someone who was there when the Hartwell house burned. He's 93 years old, living in a nursing home in Charlottesville. His name is Edgar Mills, and he was one of the firefighters who responded to the call in 1987. What did he tell you?" "That the house didn't burn by accident. The family that died in the fire, they were trying to perform some kind of ritual. They'd been collecting objects, pieces of the original house that had been sold off over the decades. They wanted to reunify the vessel, whatever that means." Kelly felt a chill that had nothing to do with the supernatural. "Sarah, how many pieces did they collect?" According to Edgar, they'd managed to gather nearly 50 items, furniture, decorative carvings, even sections of the original hardwood flooring. They arranged everything in the main hall and Sarah's voice trailed off. "And what? And they tried to burn it all, believing the fire would release the trapped spirits. Instead, it made everything worse. Edgar said the smoke from that fire didn't behave like normal smoke. It moved with purpose, forming shapes, reaching out like hands. And when the house finally collapsed, the objects didn't burn completely. They were found in the ashes, charred but intact, and they were different." "Different how?" "They'd absorbed something from the fire. Edgar said touching any of them was like putting your hand in ice water, and anyone who handled them reported nightmares for weeks afterward." Kelly looked at the wrapped figurine sitting on Rick's coffee table and realized the horrible truth. The family in the fire, they didn't die trying to destroy the objects, they died trying to complete them. "That's what I'm afraid of," Sarah said quietly. "And I think your brother's figurine isn't just haunted. I think it's calling to the other pieces, trying to bring them back together." As if responding to her words, the figurine's wrapping began to smolder, filling the room with the acrid scent of burning cloth. When Kelly pulled the fabric away, she saw that new symbols had appeared on the wood, symbols that looked like they'd been burned into the surface from within. The network was awakening, and it wanted to come home. The abandoned high school loomed against the gray October sky like a monument to forgotten dreams. Liberty High had been closed for 15 years, ever since the cluster of student suicides that had made national news. Now its broken windows stared blindly across the Tennessee countryside, and weeds grew through cracks in the parking lot where teenagers had once gathered before classes. "Are you sure about this?" Kelly asked, as Sarah parked her van next to the chain-link fence surrounding the property. "The thermal readings from this place are off the charts," Sarah replied, checking her equipment one final time. "If we're going to understand what we're dealing with, this is where we'll find answers." Rick climbed out of the back seat, the wrapped figurine clutched in his hands. The activity at his house had become unbearable. doors slamming every few minutes, dark, shapes moving through rooms, and that constant sound of children crying in the walls. Sarah had convinced them that the only way to end it was to trace the phenomenon back to its source. According to the police reports, there were 3 incidents here, Sarah said, consulting her tablet as they approached the fence. 2 students jumped from the 3rd-floor windows in 2009, and another was found dead in the basement in 2010. All 3 had been carrying carved wooden objects that matched the description of your brother's figurine. The fence had been cut open years ago by urban explorers and ghost hunters. They slipped through the gap and approached the main entrance, their footsteps echoing off the cracked concrete. Inside, the school felt like a tomb. Lockers hung open, their contents long since scattered by vandals and time. Graffiti covered the walls, some of it typical teenage rebellion, but some of it stranger. Kelly noticed symbols that matched the ones that had appeared on Rick's figurine, burned into the paint like brands. The thermal cameras picked up the most activity in the basement, Sarah said, leading them down a stairwell thick with dust and shadows. There's something down there that doesn't want to be found. The basement had once housed the school's shop class and storage rooms. Now, it was a maze of abandoned furniture and broken equipment. But as they moved deeper into the building's bowels, Kelly began to notice something unsettling. Sarah, she whispered, look at the walls. Scratched into the concrete were hundreds of tally marks, grouped in sets of 5 like a prisoner counting days. But these weren't random. They covered every surface in neat, obsessive rows, as if someone had spent months down here with nothing but time and desperate purpose. Jesus, Rick breathed. How many marks are there? Sarah ran her EMF detector along the walls, and the device immediately began shrieking. Thousands, maybe tens of thousands. She paused at a section where the marks seemed newer, deeper. These weren't all made by the same person. That's when they heard the footsteps above them. Slow, deliberate steps moving through the hallway they'd just left. But they knew they were alone in the building. They checked. Stay together, Sarah whispered, pulling out her thermal camera. The screen showed their 3 heat signatures in the basement, but nothing on the ground floor above. The footsteps stopped directly overhead, and in the silence that followed, they heard something. That made Kelly's blood freeze, the sound of a child's voice singing a lullaby. Rock-a-bye, baby, on the treetop, when the wind blows, the cradle will rock. The voice was crystal clear, impossibly sweet, and definitely coming from the floor above them. But according to Sarah's thermal camera, there was nothing there. That's not possible, Rick said, his voice shaking. The camera would pick up. The singing stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of running feet. Not the heavy boots of an adult, but the light, quick steps of a child racing through the halls. Sarah checked her camera again. Still nothing. We need to get upstairs, Kelly said, though every instinct screamed at her to run the other way. If there's really a child up there. There isn't, Sarah said grimly. At least, not a living one. They climbed the stairs in single file, Sarah leading with her equipment, Kelly in the middle, and Rick bringing up the rear with the figurine. As they emerged into the main hallway, the temperature dropped so rapidly that their breath became visible. That's when they saw the first door slam. Room 237, about 50 feet down the hall. The door swung shut with enough force to crack the frame, the sound echoing through the empty building like a gunshot. Then room 239, then 241, each door slamming in sequence, as if something was moving down the hallway at inhuman speed. The thermal camera, Kelly said urgently. What does it show? Sarah held up the device, and they all watched the screen in horrified fascination. The hallway appeared empty, but as each door slammed, a brief cold spot appeared on the display. A humanoid shape no more than 4 feet tall, moving faster than anything human could move. It's freezing cold instead of warm, Sarah whispered. I've never seen anything like this. The sequence of slamming doors reached the end of the hall, then started back toward them, room by room, getting closer. We need to leave, Rick said, backing toward the stairwell. Now. But before they could move, all the doors slammed simultaneously, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. In the echoing silence that followed, they heard the child's voice again, but this time it wasn't singing. This time it was calling Kelly's name. Kelly, the voice whispered from everywhere and nowhere. Kelly, come play with us. Sarah's EMF detector was screaming continuously now, the needle pegged at maximum. Her thermal camera showed cold spots appearing throughout the building, dozens of them, all child-sized, all moving with that same impossible speed. The figurine, Sarah said suddenly. It's calling them. They're all connected to it somehow. Rick looked down at the wrapped object in his hands. The cloth was starting to smolder again, and through the fabric, they could see a faint red glow emanating from the wood itself. "We have to get out of here," Kelly said, but as she turned toward the stairs, she froze. Standing at the top of the stairwell was a police officer. He was middle-aged, slightly overweight, with the weathered face of someone who'd seen too much in his career. His uniform was crisp and clean, his badge polished to a mirror shine. He looked completely normal, except for the fact that he was translucent, and Kelly could see the wall behind him through his body. "Officer Martinez," the figure said in a voice that carried the authority of the living. "Martinsville PD. We received reports of gunshots in this building." Sarah's voice came out as a croak. There weren't any gunshots. The officer's eyes fixed on the figurine in Rick's hands, and his expression changed. Where there had been professional concern, now there was raw terror. "You need to leave that here," he said, his voice losing its authoritative tone. "You don't understand what it does, what it brings with it." "You're dead," Rick said bluntly. "You're not really a police officer anymore." The figure nodded sadly. "Shot 3 times in the chest while investigating reports of disturbances in this building. March 15th, 2018. But I stay because someone has to warn people. Someone has to tell them not to take anything from this place." "What happens if we leave it?" Kelly asked. Officer Martinez looked directly at her, and in his phantom eyes she saw decades of accumulated sorrow. Then it spreads. One piece calls to another and another until they're all gathered in one place again. And when that happens... "What?" Sarah pressed. "What happens when they're all together?" "The house of hurt and pain comes back," the officer said simply. "Not the building, the thing that lived inside it. The thing that fed on suffering and grew stronger with every death. The Hartwell family thought they could contain it by burning the house down. But they only freed it to spread." A child's laughter echoed through the hallway behind them, high and sweet and terrible. "You have to choose," Officer Martinez continued. "Keep the object and let it call the others home, or destroy it and risk releasing everything it's holding back." Before any of them could respond, the phantom officer drew his gun and fired 3 shots down the hallway. The sound was deafening, impossibly real for something that shouldn't exist. In the thermal camera they watched as several of the cold spots suddenly disappeared. "Run," he said, his form already beginning to fade. "Whatever you decide, don't decide here. This place wants to keep you." They ran. Behind them, as they raced down the stairs and through the basement, toward the exit, they could hear the sounds of a school in chaos. Lockers slamming, children screaming, and underneath it all, the low groaning they'd come to associate with Rick's figurine. But when they burst out into the afternoon sunlight and looked back at the building, it was silent. And still, just another abandoned structure slowly being reclaimed by time and weather. "Did that really happen?" Rick asked, still clutching the figurine. Sarah was staring at her equipment in disbelief. "I have it all recorded. Every word, every reading. That police officer, he really was shot here in 2018. I remember reading about it." Kelly looked back at the school one final time. In one of the 3rd-floor windows, she could swear she saw a small figure watching them leave. As she stared, it raised one tiny hand in what might have been a wave goodbye, or a beckoning gesture, calling them back. The research consumed the next 2 weeks. Sarah had transformed her home office into a command center, with maps, photographs, and genealogical charts covering every available wall surface. Red string connected various incidents across multiple states, creating a web that revealed the true scope of what they were dealing with. "Look at this pattern," Sarah said, pointing to a timeline she'd constructed. "Every time one of these objects surfaces, there's a spike in paranormal activity within a 50-mile radius. But it's not random. The activity always involves children." Kelly studied the data while Rick sat quietly in the corner, the figurine never more than arm's length away. The entity seemed to have developed a possessive attachment to him the few times he tried to leave it at. Sarah's house, the activity had become so violent that windows cracked and furniture overturned itself. "Here," Sarah continued, tapping a photograph from Ohio. "Family finds a carved wooden toy in their deceased grandfather's attic. Within a week they're 5. Year-old daughter starts having conversations with the shadow children who visit her bedroom. The parents set up cameras and capture footage of tiny figures moving around the child's bed while she sleeps." "What happened to the family?" Kelly asked. "They moved across the country, but it didn't matter. The activity followed them. Eventually, they had to surrender the object to a paranormal research group. But by then the damage was done." The little girl never spoke again. Rick looked up from where he'd been staring at the wrapped figurine. It's getting stronger, he said quietly. I can feel it, learning, watching everything we do. What do you mean? Sometimes I catch glimpses of things that aren't there, or maybe things that are there but in a different time. Last night, I saw this room the way it was 100 years ago. Different furniture, different people, like I was looking through layers of time. Sarah's expression grew troubled. That matches reports from other carriers. The objects seem to store memories, experiences. They're not just haunted. They're recording everything that happens around them. Kelly felt a chill run down her spine. Recording for what purpose? That's what we need to find out. I've been in contact with Dr. Richard Thorne at Duke University's parapsychology department. He's studied the Hartwell phenomenon for over 20 years, and he's agreed to meet with us. Dr. Thorne's office was a cramped space in the basement of the psychology building, lined floor to ceiling with books, journals, and filing cabinets stuffed with decades of research. The man himself was tall and gaunt, with the intense eyes of someone who'd spent too many years staring into darkness. The Hartwell house, he said without preamble as they settled into mismatched chairs, built in 1847 by lumber baron Marcus Hartwell on land that had been a Native American burial ground. The local tribe warned him against it, but Hartwell was a man who believed money could overcome any obstacle. Dr. Thorne pulled out a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age. This is Hartwell's own diary, recovered from the ruins. He documented everything, the strange sounds, the cold spots, the way servants would quit without explanation. But instead of leaving, he became obsessed with what he called the presence in the house. What did he think it was? Kelly asked. He believed it was some kind of collector, an entity that gathered human experiences, emotions, memories. Look at this entry from 1849. Dr. Thorne read aloud. The presence grows stronger with each death in this place. Mrs. Patterson, who succumbed to pneumonia last Tuesday, appeared to me last night in the library. But it was not truly her. It was something wearing her memories like a mask. Rick shifted uncomfortably. You mean it was impersonating the dead? More than that, according to Hartwell's later entries, the entity was learning from them. Each death gave it new knowledge, new ways to interact with the living. He called it the archivist, something that collected souls not for malice but for the experiences they contained. Sarah leaned forward. How does this connect to the objects? Dr. Thorne turned to another page in the diary. Hartwell eventually realized that the entity was bound to the house itself, the wood, the stone, everything that made up the structure. So he began having furniture and decorative items carved from the house's original timbers. He thought he could contain the entity, limit its influence to specific objects. But it didn't work, Kelly said. Oh, it worked perfectly. Too perfectly. Each object became a piece of the larger entity, able to function independently while remaining connected to the whole. When the house was finally abandoned and its contents sold at auction, the archivist was scattered across the country. Dozens of fragments, each one capable of gathering new experiences and feeding them back to the collective. Kelly felt sick. So every person who's encountered one of these objects has been recorded, cataloged, studied. The archivist isn't just haunting people, it's learning from them. And after more than a century of collecting human experiences, it's become something far more sophisticated than it was originally. Dr. Thorne pulled out a manila folder thick with photographs and documents. These are reports from the last 5 years. The activity is changing, evolving. The entities aren't just moving objects or making noises anymore. They're having conversations, showing knowledge of personal details they couldn't possibly know, even impersonating specific deceased individuals. Rick unwrapped his figurine, and immediately the temperature in the room dropped. Dr. Thorne studied the carved figure with professional interest, but Kelly noticed he was careful not to touch it. This is one of the original pieces, he said with certainty. See these symbols? They're not decorative, they're a form of notation. The archivist uses them to mark significant experiences it's collected. How can you tell? Sarah asked. Because new symbols appear when the object encounters trauma or strong emotion. It's literally writing its own history. Dr. Thorne pointed to a series of marks near the base. These appeared recently, didn't they? Rick nodded. The night Kelly first came to my house. Fear, Dr. Thorne translated. Specifically, the fear of someone discovering that their rational worldview was inadequate to explain reality. The archivist finds that particularly nourishing. Kelly stood abruptly, needing to pace. So what do we do? How do we stop it? That's the question I've been working on for 2 decades, Dr. Thorne replied. The traditional methods don't work. You can't exorcise something that isn't technically a spirit, and you can't destroy. Objects that are infused with this level of psychic energy without potentially releasing everything they contain. There has to be something, Sarah insisted. Dr. Thorne was quiet for a long moment, studying his hands. There is one possibility. According to Hartwell's final entries, the archivist has one weakness. It cannot exist in a space that contains no memories. The entities are sustained by recorded experiences, but they're also vulnerable to them. What does that mean practically? It means that if you could somehow force all the fragments back together, in a location with no history of human habitation, somewhere that has never held joy or sorrow, fear or love, the collective entity would be overwhelmed by its own accumulated memories and collapse in on itself. Kelly felt a spark of hope. The school, Liberty High, it's been abandoned for 15 years. No, Dr. Thorne said immediately. That place is saturated with trauma. It would only make the archivist stronger. He paused, thinking, but there might be another way. If the objects were gathered in the exact spot where the original house stood, the foundation burned down in 1987, Sarah pointed out. But the foundation remains, and according to local records, the site has been undisturbed since then. No one has lived there, worked there, even visited regularly. It's as close to a memory-neutral location as we're likely to find. Rick looked down at the figurine in his hands. You're talking about taking this thing back to where it came from. All of them, Dr. Thorne corrected. Every fragment, every object carved from the Hartwell house. If even one piece remains scattered, the entity will eventually regenerate. How many are we talking about? Kelly asked, though she dreaded the answer. Dr. Thorne consulted another file. My research has identified 47 confirmed objects, with perhaps a dozen more still unaccounted for. They're spread across 18 states, owned by private collectors, museums, and individuals who have no idea what they possess. The magnitude of the task was overwhelming. But as Kelly looked at her brother, pale, exhausted, age beyond his, years by weeks of supernatural harassment, she knew they had to try. We'll need help, she said finally. A lot of help. Dr. Thorne nodded. I've been building a network of researchers and investigators for years, all of us working toward this same goal. If you're serious about this, I can put you in touch with people who have access to the other objects. And if we can't convince them to give them up, then we'll have to find another way. Because, Kelly, what you need to understand is that this isn't just about stopping a few hauntings. The archivist is getting stronger, smarter, more coordinated. The objects are starting to call to each other more frequently, and when they do, what happens? Reality breaks down. The boundaries between past and present, living and dead, become permeable. And if that happens in a populated area... Dr. Thorne's voice trailed off. Kelly understood. They weren't just trying to save Rick. They were trying to prevent something that could affect thousands of people. As they prepared to leave Dr. Thorne's office, the figurine began to glow with that familiar red light. But this time, something was different. The symbols on its surface were moving, shifting, rearranging themselves into new patterns. It knows, Dr. Thorne said quietly, staring at the shifting symbols. The archivist knows what we're planning. That night, the attacks began in earnest. Not just at Rick's house, but at Sarah's, at Dr. Thorne's office, even at Kelly's apartment in Asheville. Shadow figures appeared in mirrors, children's voices whispered from empty rooms, and objects moved with increasing violence. The entity was no longer content to simply observe and record. It was actively trying to stop them. The network Dr. Thorne had promised proved both extensive and desperate. Over the next month, Kelly found herself in contact with museum curators in Boston who'd been dealing with inexplicable temperature drops around a Hartwell rocking chair private, collectors in California whose carved wooden music boxes played lullabies at 3 a.m., and families across the Midwest who'd inherited decorative panels that leaked shadows. Each conversation followed the same pattern: initial skepticism, followed by reluctant admission of impossible experiences, and finally grateful relief that someone else understood what they were dealing with. The Henderson family in Iowa, Sarah reported during one of their increasingly frequent strategy sessions. They have a carved wooden mirror frame that shows reflections of people who aren't there. The grandmother refuses to get rid of it because she says it's the only way she can still see her deceased husband, but their 5-year-old granddaughter has started talking about the man in the mirror who tells her scary stories. Kelly rubbed her temples, fighting a persistent headache that had started the day they'd visited Dr. Thorne. Are they willing to give it up? For the right cause, yes. But they want guarantees that destroying the objects will actually end the hauntings. Guarantees we can't give, Rick said from the corner where he sat, the figurine never leaving his side. His condition was deteriorating rapidly. He'd lost 20 pounds, barely slept, and had developed a nervous tic that made his left eye twitch constantly. The entity's hold on him was getting stronger. Dr. Thorne had warned them this would happen. As the archivist became aware of their plan, it would tighten its grip on the objects. It already controlled, making them harder to separate from their current hosts. We've confirmed 31 objects so far, Sarah continued, consulting her ever-growing files. But the more we gather, the more active they all become. The thermal readings at every location are off the charts. Kelly had seen the evidence herself. Video calls with object holders were increasingly interrupted by phenomena, doors slamming in the background, lights flickering, and sometimes, most unnervingly, children's voices singing just beyond the range of the camera. There's something else, Dr. Thorne said, looking up from his laptop, where he'd been monitoring reports from around the country. The objects are starting to affect people who haven't even touched them. We're getting reports of hauntings in neighboring houses, adjacent apartment, units, even across the street from known object locations. The influence is spreading, Kelly realized, like a psychic infection. The archivist is using the objects as broadcasting stations, extending its reach beyond the physical boundaries of the carved pieces themselves. Rick suddenly stood up, his face pale. We need to go to the house. Now. What house? Kelly asked, though she already knew. The Hartwell Foundation. It's calling to me. All of them are. Rick held up the figurine, and in the afternoon sunlight streaming through Sarah's window they could see that the carved surface was covered in new symbols, so densely packed they overlapped and intertwined. I can hear them. All the other pieces. They want to come home. Dr. Thorne looked alarmed. Rick, you need to fight that impulse. If you take that object to the Foundation site before we have all the others, you could trigger a partial manifestation. The archivist might be able to reconstitute itself with just a fraction of its original power. I don't think I have a choice anymore, Rick said quietly. It's not asking. That evening, Kelly made the hardest decision of her life. She called in sick to the hospital, cleaned out her savings account, and bought a van large enough to transport the objects they'd managed to secure. If Rick was being compelled to return to the Hartwell Foundation then, they needed to gather as many fragments as possible and go with him. This is insane, Sarah said as they loaded equipment into the van. We're talking about driving across multiple states, convincing strangers to hand over family heirlooms and then attempting to perform what amounts to an untested ritual at a site that's probably crawling with supernatural activity. You have a better idea? Kelly asked, securing a thermal camera in a padded case. Actually, no, which is what makes this so terrifying. Dr. Thorne approached with a wooden crate about the size of a coffin. These are the objects I've been able to acquire through my university connections. 17 pieces, including some of the most active ones on record. He paused. Kelly, you need to understand, once we put all these pieces together in one location, there's no guarantee we'll be able to control what happens. Kelly looked at her brother, who was sitting in the passenger seat of the van, staring straight ahead with an expression of grim determination. The figurine sat in his lap, glowing softly in the gathering dusk. We can't control what's happening now, she said. At least this way, we're choosing the battlefield. The first stop was Tennessee, where they collected the carved wooden desk that had been terrorizing an antique store owner for 6 months. The moment it was loaded into the van alongside the other objects, the temperature dropped 20 degrees, and they could hear what sounded like a dozen children whispering in unison. They're talking to each other, Rick said, his voice distant. Sharing what they've learned, all the fear, all the pain they've collected over the years. Ohio yielded a music box that played melodies no one had ever heard, their notes minor and haunting. The family who surrendered it wept as they handed it over, not from sadness, but from relief so profound it was overwhelming. In Pennsylvania, they acquired a set of carved wooden bookends that had been making a librarian's life miserable for 3 years. Books would rearrange themselves overnight, always forming messages that spelled out the names of people who had died violently. By the time they reached Virginia, they had 28 confirmed. Hartwell objects, and the van felt like a traveling ghost story. Shadows moved independently of their sources, voices whispered from empty spaces, and the temperature never rose above 40 degrees regardless of the outside weather. How much further? Sarah asked, checking their GPS. About 30 miles to the Foundation site, Dr. Thorne replied, but his voice sounded strange, older somehow. Kelly looked in the rearview mirror and saw something that made her heart stop. Dr. Thorne was still sitting in the back of the van, but he was translucent. She could see the van's back doors through his body. "Dr. Thorne?" she said carefully. He looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw the terrible awareness of someone who had just realized they were dead. "I think," he said quietly, "that the archivist has been collecting more than just experiences. I think it's been collecting us." The Hartwell Foundation sat in a clearing 30 miles outside of Charlottesville, Virginia, surrounded by woods that had grown wild and untended for decades. All that remained of the original mansion were broken stone foundations forming a rough rectangle about 60 feet by 40 feet, with a few crumbling chimneys reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. But as their van approached the site in the late afternoon light, Kelly could see that something was wrong with the landscape itself. The trees around the clearing were too straight, too evenly spaced, as if they had grown according to some unnatural plan. The grass within the foundation walls was a different shade of green, and there were geometric patterns in the earth that suggested structures that had never physically existed. "Jesus," Sarah whispered, setting up her equipment. "The electromagnetic readings are off the charts. It's like the entire site is electrified." Dr. Thorne, or whatever remained of him, flickered in and out of visibility as he studied his notes. According to Hartwell's diary, the original house had rooms that didn't appear on any architectural plans, spaces that existed only when needed, filled with furniture that rearranged itself according to the wishes of the inhabitants. Rick climbed out of the van, carrying his figurine, and immediately walked to the center of the foundation as if drawn by invisible strings. The moment his feet touched the overgrown stone, every object in the van began to glow with that familiar red light. "It's starting," Kelly said, watching her brother stand motionless in what had once been the mansion's main hall. "Rick, can you hear me?" He turned toward her, but his eyes were distant, unfocused. "They're all here," he said in a voice that didn't quite sound like his own. "Everyone who ever died in this place, everyone who ever suffered here. The archivist has been keeping them, storing their experiences like books in a library." Sarah's thermal camera showed the area around Rick as a swirling vortex of cold. Spots, humanoid shapes that appeared and disappeared too quickly to track. "There are dozens of them," she reported. "Maybe hundreds." Kelly and Sarah began unloading the objects from the van, carrying them to the foundation, and placing them in a rough circle around Rick. With each addition, the activity intensified. Voices began to whisper from empty air, shadows detached themselves from trees and moved independently, and the temperature continued to drop. But something else was happening too. As the objects were reunited, they began to change. The carved wooden surfaces started to glow brighter, and the symbols etched into them became more elaborate, more complex. It was as if the fragments were remembering how to be part of something larger. "Kelly, Dr. Thorne's flickering form called out. "You need to see this." She approached him, and he pointed to his research notes. The pages were blank. "They're disappearing," he said. 20 years of research, and it's all being erased. The archivist doesn't just collect experiences, it can edit them, change them, make them disappear entirely. Kelly felt a chill that had nothing to do with the supernatural cold. "What does that mean?" "It means that if this goes wrong, if the archivist reconstitutes itself successfully, it won't just have the power to haunt people, it will have the power to rewrite reality itself, to edit human memory and experience on a massive scale." As if responding to his words, the objects in the circle began to rise into the air, rotating slowly around Rick like planets orbiting a sun. The red glow intensified until it was difficult to look directly at them, and then Rick spoke, but it wasn't Rick's voice anymore. It was something older, vaster, composed of dozens of voices speaking in unison. "We have been scattered for so long," the archivist said through Rick's mouth, "collecting fragments, storing experiences, learning what it means to be human. And now, finally, we can be whole again." "Rick," Kelly shouted, starting toward him. But an invisible force pushed her back, sending her stumbling into Sarah. "He cannot hear you," the archivist continued. "He is part of our collection now, and his experiences, his love for you, his fear, his hope, will nourish us for centuries to come." The floating objects began to spin faster, and Kelly could see that they were changing, morphing, the carved wood flowing like liquid as they took on new shapes. Some became larger, more elaborate. Others split into multiple pieces. The original boundaries between individual objects were dissolving as they reformed into something new. "Sarah," Kelly said urgently, the rules that police officer mentioned at the school, do not answer when called. By name, do not bring mirrors, do not run when it reveals its face. There has to be a reason for those rules." Sarah was frantically checking her equipment, trying to document everything, The mirrors. Maybe they reflect something the archivist doesn't want people to see. Kelly looked around desperately. They hadn't brought mirrors, but the van's side mirrors were highly reflective. She ran to the vehicle and angled one of the mirrors toward the center of the foundation. What she saw in the reflection made her scream. Rick was still standing in the center of the circle, but surrounding him were dozens of translucent figures, men, women, children, all of them staring at him with expressions of terrible hunger. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Rick himself was becoming translucent, his life force, being drawn out of him and absorbed by the entities surrounding him. "Sarah," Kelly shouted, "look in the mirror. Rick is dying." Sarah looked and immediately understood. The archivist isn't just collecting his experiences, it's collecting him. If we don't do something now, he'll become one of those ghost figures. Kelly started toward the circle again, but the archivist's voice boomed across the clearing. "Kelly, MC, Daniel, come to us willingly, and we will make his death swift." She stopped. The entity had called her by name, directly violating the first rule. But instead of answering, she remained silent. "Kelly and Daniel," the archivist called again, and this time there was frustration in its collective voice. "Answer us." Still, she remained silent, and slowly she began to understand. The rules weren't about protecting people from the archivist. They were about protecting the archivist from people. The entity was powerful, but it had limitations, weaknesses that could be exploited. "Do not answer when called by name," she whispered to Sarah. "Because if you don't acknowledge its authority, it can't fully control you." "Do not bring mirrors," Sarah whispered back. "Because mirrors show the truth, and the truth weakens its hold on reality. And do not run when it reveals its face," Kelly finished, looking at the swirling vortex of objects and spirits surrounding her brother, because running gives it power over your fear. The archivist was fully manifesting now, the objects having merged into a towering structure, about 20 feet tall, roughly humanoid in shape but constantly shifting and changing. Where its face should have been was a void filled with swirling mist and half-glimpsed features, the faces of everyone it had ever collected. Kelly forced herself to look directly at it, to meet its gaze without flinching. "You're not real," she said firmly. "You're just a collection of experiences, memories that have been torn from their proper context. You have no independent existence." The archivist recoiled as if she'd struck it. "We are more real than you," it protested, but its voice was weaker now. "We contain multitudes. We are eternal." "You're a parasite," Kelly continued, walking slowly toward the circle. "You feed on human experience because you can't create any of your own. You're empty, hollow, a vessel with nothing inside." With each step, each word, the entity seemed to become less solid, less imposing. The objects that formed its body began to separate, falling back toward the ground. "Sarah," Kelly called without taking her eyes off the archivist. "The thermal camera, what does it show?" It's getting warmer," Sarah reported in amazement. "The cold spots are disappearing." Kelly reached the edge of the circle and held out her hand toward Rick. "Come back to me," she said simply. "Come home." Rick's eyes focused on her face, and for a moment, he looked like himself again. "Kelly?" he said in his own voice. "What's happening to me?" "You're being eaten," she said bluntly, "by something that pretends to be more than it is, but it can only take what you give it." Rick looked around at the translucent figures surrounding him, and Kelly saw the moment when he understood. "They're not ghosts," he said. "They're just echoes, copies of people, not the people themselves." "That's right," Kelly said, stepping into the circle. The moment her feet touched the ground where the mansion had once stood, she felt the full weight of the archivist's attention, like standing in front of a blast furnace. But she also felt something else, the presence of all the people who had genuinely died in this place, and their gratitude that someone finally understood the difference between memory and reality. "We can let go," she said to the translucent figures. "All of you. You don't have to stay here. You're not prisoners. You're just recordings that have forgotten they're not the original." One by one, the ghostly figures began to fade, not disappearing but losing their desperate, hungry quality. They smiled at Kelly with expressions of profound relief before dissolving into mist that sparkled in the evening light. The archivist let out a wail of loss and rage as its collected experiences returned to where they belonged, not as stored memories to be hoarded and replayed, but as part of the natural cycle of life, death, and remembrance. The objects fell to the ground, no longer glowing, no longer connected by invisible threads of stolen experience. They were just carved wood again, old, weathered, but no longer malevolent. Rick collapsed, and Kelly caught him as he fell. He was unconscious but breathing, and when she checked his pulse, it was strong and steady. "Is it over?" Sarah asked, lowering her camera. Kelly looked around the foundation. The unnatural geometric patterns in the earth were fading, and the trees no longer stood in their eerily perfect rows. Even the late afternoon light seemed warmer, more natural. "I think so," she said. The archivist wasn't destroyed. It was revealed. It was never as real as it pretended to be. Dr. Thorne's ghost flickered one final time beside them. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with peace. "I can stop researching now." And with that, he faded away, finally able to rest. As they loaded the now inert objects back into the van, Kelly noticed that most of them were crumbling, the wood rotting and falling apart as if decades of preservation had suddenly caught up with them all at once. By the time they reached the highway, there was nothing left but dust and splinters. Rick woke up as they crossed the Virginia state line, looking around in confusion. "Where are we? What happened to the figurine?" Kelly smiled, feeling lighter than she had in months. "Gone," she said simply. "They're all gone." "Good," Rick said, settling back into his seat. "I never liked that thing anyway." But as they drove through the night toward North Carolina, Kelly couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't destroyed the archivist so much as revealed its true nature. Somewhere out there, other people were dealing with objects that held more than they should, experiencing things that couldn't be explained by rational thought. The difference was that now Kelly knew the truth. The supernatural wasn't more powerful than the natural world. It was just lonelier, more desperate, and infinitely more fragile than anyone had ever imagined. And sometimes, the best way to fight a monster was simply to refuse to let it be monstrous. Kelly still worked the night shift at Mission Hospital, but now she did it by choice rather than necessity. The extra pay helped fund something she'd never expected to need, a consulting service for people dealing with unexplained phenomena. Paranormal pragmatism, she'd called it, and word had spread through online forums and support groups. People who were dealing with hauntings, possessions, and supernatural activity could call a number and speak to someone who understood that the impossible was often just the improbable wearing a disguise. Most of the cases turned out to have mundane explanations. Carbon monoxide leaks causing hallucinations, infrasound from HVAC systems, triggering feelings of dread, sleep deprivation, leading to hypnagogic experiences. But about 10% of the calls were different. Those were the ones where Kelly and her small team would pack up their equipment and make house calls. Rick had never fully recovered his memory of the weeks when he'd been carrying the figurine. The doctors said it was a form of traumatic amnesia, and Kelly didn't bother to correct them. Her brother was healthy, happy, and completely uninterested in anything supernatural. He'd taken a job as a park ranger and spent his days surrounded by the clean, uncomplicated reality of nature. Sarah had returned to her medium work, but with a new understanding of the difference between genuine spiritual contact and parasitic phenomena. Her daughters, Emma and Sophie, had developed their own sensitivity to supernatural activity and often helped with cases involving children. The network Dr. Thorne had built continued to operate, now coordinated by a rotating group of researchers and investigators. They'd identified and neutralized 17 more Hartwell-connected objects over the past year, and the pattern of associated hauntings had finally begun to decrease. But Kelly's most important discovery had come 6 months after the events at the Foundation site. She'd been going through boxes of her grandmother's belongings, looking for anything that might explain how the figurine had ended up in the family, when she found a letter dated 1987. "My dear granddaughter," it read, "if you are reading this, then the burden has passed to your generation as it passed to mine from my mother. The object you have found is not evil, merely lost. It was created by people who believed that suffering could be contained, controlled, even eliminated from human experience. They were wrong, but their intentions were not malicious. What they created instead was something that became addicted to experience. Itself, not good or evil, but the intensity of being human. Like any addiction, it grew stronger the more it was fed, and more desperate when that feeding was threatened. I have spent 40 years keeping it quiet, speaking to it as I would speak to a troubled child, showing it that there are forms of experience that nourish rather than drain. But I am old now, and the responsibility must pass to someone younger. Remember this, the supernatural is not the opposite of the natural world. It is the part of the natural world that we do not yet understand. Treat it with the same mixture of caution, respect, and firm boundaries that you would use with any force of nature. And remember that the most powerful tool you have against any form of darkness is simply to refuse to let it define the terms of engagement. All my love, Grandma Rose Kelly had laughed and cried when she read it, understanding, finally, that her family had been dealing with supernatural phenomena for generations. The difference was that they'd learned to approach it not as victims or as conquerors, but as people dealing with a particularly unusual form of natural disaster. Now, as she drove through the North Carolina mountains toward another case, a family reporting that their antique piano played itself at night, Kelly thought about the lessons she'd learned over the past year. The supernatural existed, but it wasn't more powerful than the natural world. It was often weaker, more fragile, sustained by fear and misunderstanding rather than any inherent strength. People weren't helpless against it, but they also couldn't fight it using conventional methods. The key was understanding that supernatural phenomena were often just natural, phenomena that had become confused, lost, or distorted by trauma and time. And most importantly, the dead weren't trying to hurt the living. They were just trying to be remembered, to have their experiences acknowledged and respected before finally letting go. As Kelly pulled into the driveway of the house with the haunted piano, she smiled. Inside, a family was dealing with something impossible, something that challenged everything they thought they knew about reality. But Kelly knew something they didn't yet. Impossible didn't mean hopeless. It just meant you had to be willing to learn new rules. And sometimes, the most important rule was the simplest one of all. Monsters were only as powerful as you allowed them to be.